Shut up and sit down.
Hi and welcome to the latest edition of ctl-alt-del-church. This week we speak to Scott McCarthy. And the first question for you, Scott, is I was trying to email you this afternoon and I couldn't find you under S. McCarthy because you've got an I in front of your name. So what on earth is that about?
That's I for Ian that my parents decided to give me and then subsequently never used. It's a real pain when you're filling in online forms now because you're invariably asked for your first name and anyway.
Brilliant. Anyway, so where in the world are you?
I'm in the parish of Garthamlock and Cragend. We're a priority area in the east end of Glasgow. We border on Easterhouse. For those of you who don't know us and where we are, it may help to know that the Fort shopping mall is entirely in our parish. So as far as I'm aware, we're the only priority area whose only supermarket is Marks and Spencer.
So is the Morrisons at the Fort not in your parish?
No, it's in Easterhouse.
It's in Easterhouse, so that's across the road.
Yes.
Right, so
we
the
all go
middle
there.
of the fort is your parish boundary?
Exactly, yes.
Wow, okay.
Yes.
Brilliant. How long have you been there, Scott?
Since October 2018, right. So about a year and a half, just over.
So you're just about settled in?
Yes.
Yeah. Have you unpacked all of your boxes?
Yes.
Excellent. Well, that's better than I've done, and I've been here for 3 years. Still wondering where things are. So the question that we have kind of started with, and it seems ridiculous now because it was such a long time ago, was around about the point of lockdown. So I'm not going to ask you what you were doing that Sunday because you probably can't remember anymore. But I suppose behind that question is always a question about what were your priorities as soon as we realised that we weren't going to be able to go to church next week. So there was a kind of period of about a week where things changed really, really quickly, and we ended up at the end of that week not being able to go to church. So what was happening around that time? Do you remember?
Yes. Oddly, perhaps, the first priority was to look beyond the church building, and that always, I guess, has been our priority. It might surprise you to learn that despite being in a priority area, we don't run a food bank, and we haven't started one since lockdown. There is, I think, a good reason for that. We recognise that long before lockdown started, that provision was being made by East End Flatpack Meals and FAIR, that's Family Action in Rogerfield and Easterhouse, to cater as best they could for families in need. There was a food bank in the church building before I came, but for a variety of reasons, principally the underfloor heating making food storage difficult, that was discontinued. So we took a very early decision not to create our own food bank on the back of the beginning of lockdown because we felt it would be a case of reinventing the wheel. We're blessed with some one or two individuals in particular who are tech savvy, so we were able to get up and running doing online services. The mode that we've chosen to use is simply to record them in our individual homes. Members of the congregation will supply different parts of the service on different weeks, and we pull it all together, or the chap who was our fabric convener and is finding a little more time in his hands pulls it all together. He would normally do our technical stuff on a Sunday, and he posts it onto our Facebook page and onto our YouTube page.
So was that decision informed by anything, or was that just what you at that point in time? That's what you thought you could do.
Yes, it was. I think asset-based community development at its best, if you like. We used the gifts and skills that we had to try and offer the best service that we could, service in all senses of the word. And we put together something that, fortunately, because of the availability of technology to more than just the minister, meant that a number of members of the congregation were involving themselves in the delivery of that, if you like. But we did also take a conscious decision that we couldn't manage Zoom worship. So we decided not to go down that road.
So would the people that are taking part now have been taking part anyway? So in kind of real life church, would those people have joined in on a Sunday and taken part in the service, or is that something new for some of them?
Most of them would have been, yes. We have one person on worship training with Hamilton Presbytery. Obviously, that was discontinued or suspended, at least for the period of lockdown. But many of our congregation have experience of worship, and we have a small worship team. So in that sense, it wasn't a change.
So one of the things that a number of congregations seem to have come up against, and ours, both Kenny and my congregation have had a similar experience with this, is there are obviously people who aren't online.
Yes.
So what's that like in your patch, and how have you dealt with that?
Difficult. What we have endeavoured to do is make contact with them in other ways. It's true of our congregation that most of them, almost all of them, who choose to have access to the service online, but we're equally conscious that that's not a big proportion of the parish. With something like 5,000 people, a little over 5,000 people living in Garthamlock and Cragend, but we only have 56 members. So there is a wider issue to reach people out with the congregational numbers and the communicants' role. That existed before the lockdown, and that exists now.
Mm-hmm. Has the lockdown made that easier, do you think?
There are certainly people watching the service online that weren't previously, although it's notoriously difficult to know, whether somebody clicks on you for 5 or 10 seconds or whether they engage with a full worship service.
Yeah, and it's always, because nobody knows who's watching. You have a sense, you might get a reasonably accurate number at some point, but even within that, you have no idea who those people are, which is a bit strange for us, isn't it? They could be anywhere, but literally anywhere.
Yes, I am conscious, and perhaps you are too, in the writing of sermons, that there's a possibility that there will be some, they may not be large in number, but there'll be some people who are not used to coming to church on a Sunday, and I suspect even subconsciously that's affected the language that I've used and the themes that I've addressed.
So in terms of the content then on a Sunday, what is it that you do? Is it shortened? Is it like 20 minutes? Is it reading maybe a prayer and a sermon? How have you structured that to try and engage with those people then, if you're conscious of that? Is it just church as normal?
It's probably more in terms of content than structure. Our online services are probably about anything between 35 and 50 minutes, depending on what goes in them. So to that extent, they're not certainly at the 50-minute limit, not a lot shorter than they previously were. Yep. I would have to say that the only content that's probably varied has been the sermon, and we don't have anybody who plays a musical instrument on a normal Sunday, so we tend to use backing tracks. So that's continued on our online services. So it's only, I think, really the content of the sermon that's varied. and I'm probably not the best person to judge how much that's changed at all.
You mean you don't watch yourself back every Sunday, Scott?
No. Although I'm interested because I don't actually see the majority of the rest of the content. I will watch the service, but yes, I fast forward to the sermon, but I'm ashamed to tell you.
What about pastoral care? So one of the challenges obviously has been that we can't go and sit in somebody's house and speak to them, which is
Yes.
a huge part of what we do most weeks. So how's that worked out for you?
Heavily reliant on the telephone. It's been a tool that I would have used pastorally anyway in my previous charge, simply because of geographical distance. But a number of our congregation are elderly. We're not unique in the Church of Scotland in those terms, certainly, but some of our members cannot get to services anyway. So what would have normally been a personal visit to wherever they live has now become a telephone call. It's interesting. Many of the elderly or people who are self-isolating that I speak to have remarked on how all of a sudden they have a greater or a more frequent relationship, communication with their neighbours. One lady I spoke to right at the outset said one of her neighbours, who she'd barely spoken to before, was round at her door offering to get shopping for her. There does seem to be a strong sense in which people have recognised that those around them may not be as able to get out and about as they are, and they've reacted accordingly and offered help.
That's always good to hear, isn't it?
Yes.
You live in an area that has a reputation. You know, the kind of the East End of Glasgow has always been a hard place, and it's always been a community that's been beset with poverty and occasionally violence and all that kind of stuff. Do you think the East End's a different place to minister than other places that you've been, or does it raise the same kinds of issues?
Yes to both, really. Clearly it is different, but clearly there are issues in common with any other parish because people are people. One of the difficulties that we have as a congregation is just gauging how we can help other people in the community. And, you know, I mentioned asset-based community development, which I'm a great believer in. And what we're trying to do before lockdown is see what was out there and see what could be done with the community. One of the first conversations I had after I came here was with a guy who had for decades been chair of one of the community councils. He was to be reading a eulogy at a funeral I was conducting, and he said, "Can we have a chat just to see where this fits in and just run this by you?" And I said, "Yes," and for reasons that I still don't understand, I said, "Right, I'll meet you at the church." I would normally say, "Come to the manse." And we met, and I let him into the building, and he said, "I've never been in here, can I have a look around?" And he had a look around and he said, "I kind of know what I'm looking at here because I do a bit of entertaining." He said, "You've got a fantastic facility here." He said, "I'm gobsmacked." And I was kind of gobsmacked too, because here was one of the principal movers and shakers of the community, and he had never been inside what is one of the very, very few usable public spaces in a community of over 5,000 people. So just after I came, our deacon, who was a 0.5 MDS, she left. She assures me those two events weren't anything more than coincidental, and in fairness, she was due to retire. But one of the very good pieces of advice she gave us was, be very careful how you choose to replace me, because you may think that you no longer need a deacon. So we commissioned somebody to do community research with a university degree in community research, and she made recommendations as to how Marion would be replaced. So we're kind of keyed up to do that, and of course the recruitment process has fallen by the wayside. But yes, trying to get back to answer your question, a taxi driver friend of mine, every time I see him, will remark that Porchester Street, where the church building is, was, as he describes it, the most dangerous street in Glasgow. There is no sense of that now, because for about the last 10 or 15 years, Garthamlock and Cragend and other areas of the East End of Glasgow has been undergoing what I describe as persimmonisation. In Garthamlock and Cragend alone, we've had 880 new houses built by persimmon. So the demographic of the community has changed. It won't surprise you to know that most of the new houses that have gone up have replaced social housing, and they are either privately owned or privately rented. So the makeup of the community has changed. And to a great extent, nobody knows just how it's made up now. Our community researcher helped with that, but obviously there is more work to be done. The latest figures we have suggest that there are still over 1,300 people in a community of just over 5,000 living in poverty. So it's clearly an issue. My sense is, well, probably the best thing I can do is quote the interim moderator who covered before I arrived. She said that her sense was there were a number of families who were one mortgage rate increase away from poverty. I suspect she would now say one pandemic away from poverty. So I suspect we've got huge issues with people that, or for people that we have no direct contact with. So yeah, we have a number of issues that were existing before COVID, and many more now, I suspect.
Yeah, it kind of magnifies everything, doesn't it? You know,
Yeah.
as soon as everything stops, then, you know, it really brings into sharp focus how precarious a lot of people's incomes are, particularly, but the kind of the whole of the economic activity of the area.
Yes.
Does that new build kind of in places that have been problematic seems to be a policy decision? You know, that's happening all over Glasgow, isn't it? That they've done the same in Drumchapel and Castlemilk and further round the new Easterhouse. Does that lead to just a split community then? You know, that on one side of the road there are these kind of private and privately rented houses, and the other side of the road are the kind of existing housing stock. So does it really just split the community in two?
I was about to agree with you until you brought in the number two. I'm not being clever, but it's very, very fragmented. It's certainly not in two parts. One of the kind of senses that I have about the people who are in what we in the community would call bought houses, privately owned or privately rented. A lot of them are obviously commuting out of the parish. There's very little work within the parish itself, apart from the fort. And we've attracted a lot of people because of the access to the motorway.
Yep.
So they disappear in the morning and they come back at night. Their children will go to the local school, obviously, but a lot of them will have preschool children. A lot of them, as I hinted at earlier, are so heavily mortgaged or with other debts relating to financing a car or whatever that they're not out at night anyway. So it's very, very difficult to get a sense of their needs.
Yeah. I wonder if being online helps with that. I can imagine that. I suppose one of the difficulties we're in a very different kind of situation. I'm in a big village, and so the people that have lived here all their lives, of which there are many, still talk about the village. Now it's 6,000 or so people now, and we've had the same issue. The same companies built lots of houses on the other side of the road, so we've gone from being a kind of old-fashioned weavers mining community to then almost being a new town. So Stonehouse was slated to be a new town,
right?
But they decided just to keep building at East Kilbride. So we've got one scheme of a new town build. So we've got one scheme that's exactly the same as the schemes in East Kilbride, and then they stopped for 20, 30 years. And then Persimmon and Barrett have come in and built on the other side of the road because it was zoned for housing. So we've got, almost kind of one side of the road is completely different to the other side of the road, and the same kind of issues that that lots of the people that moved in, because again we're next to the M74, they go out in the morning, they come back at night, their kids go to the school, but that's the only time anybody ever sees some of them. Now, that's a huge generalisation, but it seems to be a kind of similar story across the whole of West Central Scotland. They're kind of building hundreds of thousands of homes up that M8 corridor, and it I suppose begs the question: how connected to the community are the people that move in? That there are people who have lived in Garthamlock and roundabout for years and years and years, and then all of a sudden all of these new people appear, and it changes. It definitely changes the dynamic of the community in all kinds of different ways. It changes the school, it changes the parish in terms of the issues that you might be looking at and all that kind of stuff. Do you get a sense of that? Does it feel different? Do the people who have been involved for a long time seem to, do they notice that? Because the area's changed hugely in the last 20 years, hasn't it?
Yes, without a doubt. Probably 2 points spring to mind. Yes, we have almost nobody as part of our worshipping congregation who lives in a Persimmon house, apart from me. The manse is a Persimmon house and went up 2010. Probably not coincidentally the same year as the new church building went up. But Garthamlock, certainly compared with your own locale, is a relatively new community. Like Easterhouse, we started building here in 1954-55. So many of the people, right up until fairly recently, and indeed some still do, perhaps see their roots in places like Shettleston or Carntine or Denniston, from where they were moved. There was also at Cragend in particular, because of the newness of the houses there at one stage, was seen as the aspirational move from many districts of Easterhouse. That no longer happens to the same degree. But yes, the people in Persimmon houses are, to a great extent, at the moment at least, and we are conscious of this and working on it, not part of the worshipping community, even though they're very much part of the parish. But of course, even in the old days when people didn't work in Cragend or Garthamlock, they would normally go back to the places in the East End where they'd worked before they moved. There was at least one functioning pub which there no longer is. So people are not meeting to socialise. I mean, notwithstanding pubs seem to be significantly less popular than they were in the 50s anyway. There isn't a focus. And as I say, there's only 56 of us on the roll. So, I mean, we couldn't really argue that we're a focus either. If there are focal points in the parish, it would be the 3 primary schools.
It was one of the I suppose, this kind of famous omissions of the new schemes, wasn't it, that they didn't build any community buildings in any of them?
Yes.
Put them up.
Yes.
No community facilities, no shops, they just built houses and nothing else. In all
Yes.
the schemes.
There was a row of about 5 or 6 shops. They've gone and been replaced by houses, although we have a similar number of shops in Garthamlock, new build, and some shops that have been up there much longer. Another single row of about 7 or 8 retail units in Cragend.
You've mentioned asset-based community development twice now, so we're going to have to talk about it.
Yes, send this podcast to Cormac Russell.
Absolutely, I'll get him to sign my book. I'm reading Rekindling Democracy at the moment, one the other day, which I'm really enjoying.
Good.
I trained as a community worker 25, 30 years ago, did community education at Strathclyde, and I found it much more useful than any theology that I've ever done. And wonder why we don't just teach ministers how to do community work. So for me, it's not a kind of new idea. It's an extension of a lot of stuff that I've already read in the past. But I like the idea of starting, particularly in communities like yours, which have been labelled for years and years and years as problematic, starting at a completely different point of view and saying, actually, these are communities that have people who have skills and talents and gifts, just like every other community. What can we do with that to help make things better? And I guess, for me, I like that because it seems like it's the point that the gospel starts at too. That we're all created by God and imbibed with God's Spirit and loved and valued. And so the two seem to fit really well as perspectives. There seems to me to be no daylight between the two ideas. So how's asset-based community development influenced what you've done? So you've been there for 18 months. How is it impacted on what your priorities are and what your even how you began when you arrived and what you've been doing in the last 18 months?
One of the things that I learned in training from minister, and it was actually from another minister, a guy called Martin Fair. I don't know whatever happened to him, but
disappeared without a trace.
Yes, yeah. I remember him saying that he'd covenanted with the congregation at Arbroath when he went there not to change anything in the first 12 months. That was an approach I used in my previous charge and did the same here, not least because I think it can be very easy, especially if you just listen to one voice, to think, oh yes, that's right, and go off and change something and then perhaps regret it in the future. So we have kind of listened, and it's been a listening process for all of us for the reasons I've outlined, principally because the community has changed so much. We have a tremendous wealth of data now as a result of the 9 months of community research that Amy, who was here doing it for us, did. And I think we're now at the stage of kind of pulling that together. One of the disappointments that we all have is that despite the fact that ourselves and the GESH, Greater Easter House Supporting Hands, probably the only 2 public buildings of any use in the parish, certainly ours is much underutilised. had a conversation, the first conversation I ever had with one of my neighbours, and he was saying he was a member of an addiction group. And he said, we were looking for facilities. We've been meeting in the Carlton for years. And he said, we were actually looking for facilities around here. Never thought about your church. And I'm thinking, there's a kind of profile issue here. I think what we need to do, we have an indication of what people might want to start. We have been working very closely with Family Sentence, who are, as the name suggests, a group who support prisoners' families. Essentially, it's a self-help group. Most of them have first-hand experience of having one or more family members in prison. They came to us with a number of ideas about what they wanted to do, and I said, well, go away and think about which one you particularly want to try first. And we now have funding to create a community theatre, do some community drama. Citizens Theatre in Glasgow are on board with this, and 2 community drama people are going to help us with it. We were literally on the point of having our first meeting when lockdown appeared, so that's not going to happen. But you will know as well as me that there is a great sense of literacy and self-expression in the East End of Glasgow that's not always utilised. There are a number of self-esteem issues going on in the undercurrents. People think theatre or any form of dramatic self-expression is often not for them. It's the sort of thing that you might do if you come from the West End or the South Side, but not really the East End. So what we will do is draw on people's strengths and abilities to develop that. Initially, it'll be run for people during the day. We hope there will be a spin-off for people to come in the evening. We've also enlisted the help of Ian McCarthy, who you both will know. He came and spent 6 Sundays over 6 months with us last year, thinking about how we express ourselves in worship. I heard John Bell a year or 2 ago use the expression believing what we sing and singing what we believe. And what we're keen to do, I think, is devise forms of worship, particularly sung worship, that more accurately reflect our own theology. We've reflected on what we do, and we see our sense of welcome as a strength and an asset, and we're trying to sing about that and think about that a bit more than perhaps we do simply drawing down existing worship forums. What else will we do? Victoria McNulty, a local poet and writer that you may have come across, we've had connection with her in the past. She was kind enough to do an extended piece for us as part of an alternative Burns night that we ran. She has come back to us and said, because I mentioned to her this idea about harnessing people's gifts for self-expression that they don't have the confidence to use. We have an application in for funding to enable us to go around, initially the members in the congregation, and give them materials which we hope will inspire them into autobiographical writing about their experiences of the lockdown. I suspect that's relatively low tech and low cost, so that even if the funding that we've applied for doesn't come through, we can still continue with that. Yeah. So it's that sort of thing, if you like, getting people into the building, getting them to see that it's as much their building as ours, and also kind of responding to the gifts and abilities that they have.
One of the things I was reflecting on Sunday was the idea that, you know, we're looking at the end of Matthew 10, where Jesus kind of sends the disciples out. So the kind of the end of that whole chapter, where he's been saying, you know, go and do this, but it's going to be pretty rubbish and cause division and all that kind of stuff. And then kind of sums up at the end, talking about the idea of being welcomed, and how we had a chat about that during the week. And it was fascinating to, when we had the chat, that nobody saw themselves as the stranger going out to be welcomed. They all saw themselves as the person welcoming in, which I thought was really interesting, because the disciples are the ones who are the strangers.
Yes.
We identify with them. We identified with, you know, we're the church and people come to us. And that's, you know, one of the things that we talked about in a kind of really honest conversation is how difficult that is sometimes when people come, you know, and we have a, you know, to have a small group of people like you have, who obviously know each other really well and feel a real kind of sense of community, and it's their church and they've worked really hard for it all these years and all that kind of stuff. And then all of a sudden all these new people come, and whether it's just to use the building or not, that can be difficult, can't it? Because it, you know, it changes the identity, it changes their sense of agency and power, it changes all the relationships. It may, you know, it's not an easy process all the time.
No, perhaps we are blessed by a sense of vulnerability, in the sense that we are so small, with probably the same proportion of older members, maybe slightly less, as most congregations, that we're perhaps less resting on our laurels than some other congregations might be. But yes, I mean, we all have our different methods to doing the commissioning work, and it's something that strikes me about the membership of the Church of Scotland in general, and I'm conscious that it is a generalisation, but I think there is some truth that many of the members of the Church of Scotland, principally because we've failed to give them the vocabulary to do it, would have a real ability to express their faith in any way that people would consider theologically sound. And that's not patronising, or it's not meant to be, because we've let them down, and we've allowed the model to roll on from, if you like, the boom times in terms of numbers of bums on pews of the 50s and 60s, where people weren't challenged to engage with their doubts. You know, I'm thinking there as I speak of Bob Davidson's book, The Courage to Doubt. Sadly, that wasn't as widely promulgated and read as it could have been. And people, I'm sure, sat in the pews in the 50s and 60s and thought, you know, I'm struggling with that. It's not a case for most people that they get into the Church of Scotland by whatever means, and often it was following your parents or grandparents. And as you sit through a requisite number of sermons, all your doubts about faith suddenly disappear. They don't. But, you know, we've not given the people in the pews permission, never mind the vocabulary, to express their faith. Having said that, there is a great strength, I think, and it's almost, I guess, Franciscan, to be welcoming and to encourage people into a church, because that might not be seen to be great commissioning, to use a kind of trendy missiological phrase. But what it does do is it shows the love of Christ in a way that you don't need the words. People know instinctively whether they are being welcomed on a Sunday morning or not. Yeah. And often, well, almost always, explicit reference to Jesus Christ is not required at that point.
So what does that enabling of that kind of theological inquiry look like in your community then? What do you see that panning out as? How do we encourage people to have those conversations, and you as the minister, how do you enable that to happen?
It's difficult. I'm conscious that Since I came, we have had Sunday services pre-lockdown where instead of 10, 15 or more minutes of me talking, I've set one or two theological hairs running and invited people to break off into small groups and discuss it amongst themselves and feedback. Because people are not used to that approach, a lot of them have found that very uncomfortable. And I suspect one of the things that we need to do is look behind that and recognise that people are discomforted by the fact that they don't feel they have the vocabulary to express it. That's not really answering your question, but I think we've only got to the stage of recognising that people struggle doing it. Yeah. We're not sure in our own minds how we help them with that.
It's one of the things that folk have noticed about stuff like Messy Church, that actually it's the adults that benefit, because you get to go to something that's primarily aimed at small children, and so there is no pretense that anybody knows anything. And you're just helping your kids, but at the same time you're hearing all these stories that you've maybe never heard before, and having gentle conversations around them. So there is no, there's no. We make all kinds of assumptions, don't we? That people know the stories, they know what we're talking about, they've heard some of the language, and just because you've been turning up every Sunday for 50, 60 years doesn't mean that that's necessarily true. I'm always astonished when people say to me on a Sunday, I've never heard that before. Yeah. You think, well, we're just going through the lectionary, so at some point somebody's read this story to you. You've been here long enough that it's come up 3 or 4 times. So either you've not been paying attention, or the way in which we've been doing it isn't really working for folk.
Yes.
And like you said, you get to the point where people are so disempowered, they just don't know what to do with that.
Yes. We have a Bible study group that predates me. It has many strengths. One of them is that it's never been led by the minister. It's led by a member of the congregation who is not an elder, in fact. It's very, very valuable, and I know people get a lot out of it. I would be fascinated to see how the Bible passages are discussed. But of course, it would be fatal to the good work that it's doing if the minister turned up. Because, like it or not, if you come into one of these groups, somebody will ask a question and everybody else will then stop and look to you for the answer because you're perceived to be the professional theologian in the group.
I really identify with that because I mean, Scott, you and I know one another from youth assembly, from general assembly, from Jane and all those folks and all those things that I did where I was embedded in the Bible for weeks, months, days, all the way through my teenage years, like doing mission and doing cozy and doing the youth assembly and all that sort of stuff. And then going back to church and going to the house group, for example, or a Bible study like the one we're talking about, and then realizing that a lot of people who have been going to church for 40 or 50 years never had the opportunity to do that. They've just always gone on a Sunday. And then trying to help people come out of that shell to be able to do that. So we're similar to you. We've got a Bible study group that meets on I think it's a Wednesday night, and there's a prayer group that meets as well. And the minister doesn't go to either of those. They're run by our worship convener, who's one of the other folk in our congregation that are qualified to lead worship through the same scheme in Hamilton that I did with her. And that has really helped people open up and be able to talk about their faith more because it's been done, like you said, in a really nurturing and, in a way that means people can start to open up and think about, okay, how do I pray when I'm talking out loud rather than in my head? How do I lead an open prayer or take part in an open prayer? Because, I'm conscious that when I'm doing it, I'm very deliberately trying to just be natural with it and not make it sound like a high kirk prayer of approach and whatever, and it's not that I would do that anyway because I'm certainly not high. Of all the things I am, it's not high, but it's a very interesting perspective when it's not that I know that it's not that you don't feel welcome there, but it's that you don't feel needed or required for those people to be able to be ministered to in that situation, which I think is an important thing to recognise as well, because you're not always needed as the minister to do that. It's quite an important point, I think.
Yes. They would, I suspect, and it's wrong for me to kind of second guess them, but my fear, and it's a very real fear, is that they would in some sense defer to my opinion. And I would be horrified to think that they thought my interpretation of any Bible passage was any more valid than theirs, because it isn't.
It's not quite Geneva when you've got the people critiquing the sermon in the front row and having talks with the sermon minister after it. But yeah,
there is something about, you know, if you're saying you know, it goes back to the conversation we were having about asset-based community development, that, you know, the imposition of experts can be really problematic. Mm-hmm. You know, what we've done over the last how many years is to outsource our theological thinking. You know, we've put an expert in there to do it for you and just to tell you what to think, but in ways that haven't actually helped us to think at all. We've just talked at people for 20 minutes on a Sunday morning and assumed that they were listening, or that what we were saying was helpful in some way. And so to not turn up for things like that, I think, is incredibly positive, because it models what you're saying. It says, you know, you're perfectly capable of doing this yourself. Mm-hmm. And if I turn up, then I'm going to take that away from you. And I really don't want to do that, because at some point I'm going to leave. You know, I'm either going to, you know, I'm going to go somewhere else, or I'm going to retire. But at some point I leave this community. This is your community. And
yes,
you know, you need to have the skills and develop the thinking to be able to do this for yourselves, because there's no reason why you can't. And if you need me to help with things, then that's great, but that's a different thing from coming along and deferring to all this knowledge that we've apparently got, which we are acutely aware that we don't, but other people aren't.
Yes, and it may be in part due to the fact that I wasn't ordained until slightly after my 50th birthday, but I've always been very conscious that any charge that I go to, they were there a long time after before I arrived, and hopefully, unless I do something horrendous, they will be there for a long time after I go. There is another issue which I'm passionate about, and forgive me if this is going slightly off where you'd hoped it might go, but once a year, all 3 years of candidates in training would get together. I think that was normally in St Andrews in those days. So in my day, which isn't that long ago, we're talking about 15 years ago, there was about 100 of us there. And I remember Martin Scott making a genuine inquiry of us all in a plenary session. Would you mind putting your hand up if you came from a priority area? One person out of over 100 put their hand up, and I don't think that situation is improving any. One of the biggest difficulties that people in priority areas have, and it's not just confined to the Church of Scotland's perception, it's society's perception of what living in an area of multiple deprivation is like. I've only been here since, as I say, the late 2018, and I'm absolutely no expert on this or any other priority area, but I do know an awful lot more. Know an awful lot more now about Garthamlock and Cragend and priority areas problems in general than I did before I lived in one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd noticed Martin Johnson, who's been in and around priority areas kind of for the whole of his career, was writing in his blog the other day about proximity. That, you know, what we do is we read about and we study statistics and read reports, and actually what we don't do very often is actually get alongside people, and you know, live the lives that they live, and so even in terms of deployment, the priority areas that are underdeployed, compared, that ministers will pick nice places to go and live, because they make the same decisions that everybody else makes about where their kids might go to school, or what amenities that they might have, or all that kind of stuff, what the manse is like, and that's meant over the years that priority areas have found difficulty in attracting people to go and serve there, never mind producing people to serve the wider church, because of the nature of training, that I think across the denominations in the UK particularly, most of the people who go to train now are people in their middle age. They're people who've had a career and often been made redundant, because that gives them the financial backing to be able to go and take 3 or 4 years out of their life, because their kids are up, they've paid off their mortgage, and they're able at that point to do it, because what the church gives folk to look after them while they're training really isn't enough to live on across all the denominations. That's and then we're surprised that people don't come forward either in their 20s and 30s, or from areas where they just don't have that kind of financial backing behind them, or a spouse who can support them during that. And it's a real issue. I think you're right, because it perpetuates a kind of these are the people who go into ministry kind of thing, doesn't it? That there's a similarity, which isn't healthy for any kind of church, I think.
No, in terms of race and gender and financial background, there is a huge underdiversity, if you like, in the ministers that we produce. And part of that is an issue with access to university education, which we require, and I think rightly. And I know Glasgow, for example, University of Glasgow are addressing that with the way they look at candidates from areas of multiple deprivation. But for a variety of reasons, we clearly are not getting the diversity of candidates that I believe God wishes us to have.
Is there a kind of looking forward then? One of the things that people seem to be saying, and I'm not sure how much truth is in this, that this whole pandemic's given us an opportunity to stop, quite literally in some cases. So things have just stopped. We've had a bit of time to kind of get used to coping with that, and now we've got a wee bit of time to think about what's happened and what the future might look like. Do you see big changes ahead in terms of what you had thought was going to happen and what now might happen, or do you think actually things will go back to pretty much normal, or as normal as they can be in the circumstances, and we'll just get on with what we were doing before?
Are you thinking solely in terms of the church or in society in general?
Both. We'll start with the church and then we can solve the other problems.
All the problems of society. There is a real sense. I had a Zoom meeting with half a dozen other ministers this afternoon, and there's a real sense of not wanting to get back to whatever pre-existed. That would be good, certainly for us here, because as I've mentioned before, our 56 is not representative of the 5,000, and I don't want it to be representative in that sense, but I want it to be inclusive. And as we've discussed earlier, there are vast areas socioeconomically that are not being connected with. And I took a funeral recently of someone who died at the age of mid-50s, a man in his mid-50s. And what struck me was that, even in a relatively small parish, I had no knowledge of this man. He'd been living in the parish for some considerable time with family, somebody who could have got particular benefit from a renewed relationship. He would have come across Jesus Christ in some sense in his younger days, but somebody that I was simply unaware of, and I suspect was unaware of me, unaware of the congregation, unaware of the building. We have to work on being there. We've got to a stage in Scotland in 2020 that many people just don't see us as a place to turn to, whether it be in joy or despair.
What do we do about that?
The $64 question, isn't it? I'm very fond of the story of, and you'll know it well, and perhaps have even used it, of the two men walking towards each other on a beach earlier in the morning, and one man is throwing one of thousands of starfish that have been washed up on the beach back into the water. And they come close enough to speak to each other, and the guy who isn't doing the throwing back asks the first guy, "What do you think you're doing?" And he said, "I'm trying to help these starfish." And he said, "Help them?" He said, "There's thousands of them." And the guy bends down, picks up another one, casts it back in the water, and he says, "Well, I've helped that one." I think we often look at the problems, even of the church, far less wider society, and totally overwhelmed. Perhaps going back to us all being able to express a sense of welcome. We can all do that, even if we can't explain, even to our own satisfaction, on whose behalf we are doing it.
Yeah, that kind of saving the world one relationship at a time.
Yeah.
Someone else tried that once. I seem to remember. It's in a book I've got.
Can't remember his name.
Yeah, but that's, I think, we do get caught up in the bigness of everything, don't we? And we stop seeing that individual relationship that Jesus formed with everybody that he met. That he addresses the needs of the people in front of him, as opposed to saying, well, there's a societal issue here, and the things, the political change is required, and you should probably go and talk to one of the 5 different political authorities that are in charge of this. He has a conversation with people and says, "What is it you need?"
Yes.
And that's, it's so easy to get caught up in the bigness, isn't it?
Yes.
Rather than the people that we're confronted with.
Yes.
On a daily basis, or don't anymore. So what about society? How do we fix that?
I look at...
It's a non-political podcast, remember?
Yes.
Political as you like.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it, that the present government have done many things which political commentators, by and large, would not regard as typical of what they would normally do in circumstances, and an awareness of the circumstances of people's struggles have motivated them to do that. They've perhaps been pushed into a corner that they didn't want to be, and I'm sure that's certainly true economically, but they've done things that they didn't envisage themselves doing. I think what there needs to be is a greater sense of engagement with the political process. One of the things that's happened since I came here is that we now have a number of additional community councillors, including myself, some people from within the congregation, others from out with. Say what you like about community councils, in terms of that level of local government, they're the only show in town, so it's probably better to engage with them than not. But yeah, self-esteem and self-regard and feeling valued. I think what people of faith can do uniquely is to speak generously with people and let them know that they're valued. A couple of years ago, I heard the phrase that you're probably very familiar with, that's attributed to a number of people, including Maya Angelou, that people will remember not what you do for them, but how you make them feel. And my initial reaction to that was, I'm not sure that's true. But the more I reflect on it, and the more that there's a sense of enabling by helping people to see their value and that they are created in the image of God, is perhaps a very important, if not the most important thing that you can do for them.
Absolutely.
And then give them the power to get on with it and use their own gifts and talents. And I suppose it perhaps chimes with this idea of what I'm trying not to be is some sort of expert being parachuted in. Here's another white middle class male being dropped in by a national institution to sort out our problems for us without any real understanding of A, what our problems are, and B, what our gifts are.
Yeah, and it's particularly where you are, it's another, because that's how those communities have been treated for years and years and years, since they were identified as problematic. We've thrown money and resources at them without making any difference whatsoever, because they listened to the people that lived there and asked them what they needed and what their problems really were.
Yes. For fear of censorship, I shan't quote a poem, but you may be familiar with The Liaison Coordinator by Tom Leonard.
Yes.
Enough said. I suspect anybody who knows me who's listening to this broadcast will roll their eyes and say, oh, he's not quoting that again, is he?
I'll put a link to it in the show notes and people can read it themselves.
At the first meeting of the Faith Nurture Forum, I quoted it and there were one or two eyebrows raised, but perhaps no harm in that.
No. And I think, it's back to that, hearing people's stories, isn't it? Giving people the opportunity to tell their story and to be heard. We spoke to Graham McMeekin, who works for Tear Fund, and that was one of the things he was talking about, just to, the opportunity to listen to people.
Yes.
And not to say, well, I disagree with your version of events.
Yes.
Which is often what we do. Your problem really is, and if you just do this, then things will be better for you, rather than actually hearing what people are saying.
Yes.
And listening to their narrative.
It makes me smile in a good way when you see quite often quoted, or it was quoted before lockdown, about how people said they've the best job in the world. They don't, because ministers and pastors and whatever, they actually do. I've come into a role where financial burdens, and I'm conscious that this is not true for all ministers, but in my case it is, financial burdens are totally removed by the stipend. All I need to do is love people, and if that's not the best job in the world, I really don't know what is.
That seems like a very good place to finish. Scott, thank you so much for your time. It's been brilliant to speak to you and to hear about your ministry, and we wish you all the best for the future.
And to you, good catching up with you.